Hi everybody! Welcome to week 1 of our English 3180 course. So I'm hoping that by now you've been able to get a feel for the Canvas site, read through the syllabus, watch my syllabus and course intro video. All those things, if you haven't done them yet, you can totally still do. I'm going to be leaving all the materials up in perpetuity. So if you ever feel like you missed something or if you want to go back and watch videos again, it'll all be available to you for the duration of the semester. I hope everybody's having a great first week. I know I was talking to some students earlier and they were saying that the courses hadn't quite gotten rolling yet, and some of them had their first course this afternoon. So wherever you're at on the first week spectrum, I hope it's going well, and I hope that you can enjoy the sunshine at least a little bit today. In this video, I want to go over a few quick announcements, do a little housekeeping, and then I have a brief, I'm hoping to keep it really brief, mini lecture kind of going over the readings that you are assigned this week. So before I get into that, I'll just start by saying I'm including one new assignment to our weekly activities. As I was thinking about it over the past couple of days, I realized we don't really have anything in our Canvas shell that brings us all together as one whole class. The way that we would if we were face-to-face, we'd all be sitting in the same room physically. And I realized that while you have your individual assignments with your reading response papers and you have your small group assignments for your discussions, we don't really have anything that brings us all together as one big group. So you'll notice that I've created a really teeny tiny assignment called the chat check-in. And it's designed to just help us kind of keep track of each other in the whole class. I will be embedding a small prompt for the chat check-in in every weekly video. So in this way, it kind of serves as accountability for watching the videos as well. So it kind of serves double duty. It will serve as attendance and video participation. And for this first chat check-in, I'm going to use your participation to confirm your course participation within Academica. So heads up. Make sure you participate in the chat check-in, definitely this week especially, because I will use that as my guide for who is engaged and participating in our course. The prompt for this week's chat check-in is mostly an intro. Post a picture of yourself or an avatar to your Canvas profile and give us some info about who you are. And I think I even asked what kind of breakfast food you would be if you were a breakfast food. So super funny, get to know you type of question for this first chat check-in. Keep your eyes peeled because we'll be doing a chat check-in every week. The chat functions on the left-hand side of your Canvas page. If you need help finding it, just shoot me an email or post a question to the Ask and Answer board. Okay, second thing, please remember within your small group discussions, this first week, one of the things you guys have to do is decide who is going to lead the discussions on which weeks. So you can do that within the discussion board itself, or you can set up a separate Google Doc. One of my students is already on the ball with a Google Doc for her group. So make sure that you are talking to each other before you get started with this first discussion, because whoever's leading up first needs to know that this is their week, okay? So make sure within your small groups and within the discussion boards, you have communicated with each other to say who's leading when, what's the schedule. Okay, what else was I going to talk to you about? Okay, we'll roll right into our mini lecture. I just wanted to preface it by saying, if we were in a classroom together, this was a face-to-face class, one of the strategies that I would use every week would be what I call a guided discussion, which means that I would prepare a visual aid for you guys that kind of gives the bullet points, the takeaways, the main points of the readings, and then we would talk about it and add to it. So I would probably be up in front of a board as you guys were talking. I would be writing things on the whiteboard so that we would fill in my sort of bones that I have prepared with all of your awesome ideas and responses and the things that you've thought about as you've been reading this week. We're not in the classroom together. So because we're online and because I've chosen to make this class asynchronous, meaning everybody can work on it when they have time and fits in best with their schedules, what I'm going to do each week in our weekly videos is I'm going to do a brief presentation of those bones. I'll talk through the readings in not a cursory way, but I just want to get the essentials, some of the key points that I want you guys to be taking from these readings, because some of them, as you may have noticed if you started already, they're complicated. They're not written in a dumbed down fashion. You guys are going to be interacting with scholarly texts from the field of rhetoric and composition. So I will help walk you through the key points that you should absolutely take away. And then in your group discussions and in your reading responses, it's up to you to kind of expand on that with your analysis, with your interpretations. And even if you disagree with some of the points that I raise, go ahead and write about that and talk about that in your discussions. Everything's fair. Agreement, disagreement, clarifying. You'll notice that in this announcement for this week, I've also posted a little video about having fluid discussions. You may feel like, you know what, Nicole, I don't need that. But in case you do, if you feel like maybe online discussions can seem a little awkward, check out the mini lesson video on having fluid discussions. I give a lot of tips and tricks for just arming you with ways to interact with your small groups in your discussions. But say all that to say, agreeing is fine, disagreeing is fine, as long as we do it in a respectful way and we provide evidence and good reasons for whatever stance we take. Okay, I'm going to switch over to my screen share view so that you guys can see the beautiful slides. They're just slides. There's nothing too exciting about them. But I will talk through some of the key points from this week's readings, and then we'll close out this video. Okay, so just going to do a quick overview of some of the key points from this week's reading. And this is not from our first author, but it's a quote that she includes in her piece. But I just thought this was such a great quote to give us an overview for the overall stance and positionality I want us to take in this course. So Murphy says that rhetoric as a universal human activity has naturally left its records in a wide variety of cultures and languages over thousands of years of civilization. Consequently, our efforts to understand it need to be as sophisticated as the subject itself. So we're dealing with a really complex and global discipline. So that's the approach that we want to take. We're going to need to take a sophisticated approach. So Blair, in her article about the contested histories of rhetoric, she is critiquing basically a carte blanche acceptance of history as it is. She says we all have partial accounts of history. Assumptions, internal biases of historians necessarily over the centuries have twisted what we have today in terms of records and in terms of historical accounts. So I really liked this, that she, in this article, talks about how we are reading what historians have chosen. Historians' choices of what to present to us in terms of posterity. To this end, she's comparing two historical studies systems. She compares influence studies and systems studies. These are two really long-standing approaches to the history of rhetoric, and she critiques them both, right? So she calls out influence studies as emphasizing too much about ancient rhetoric and sort of calling anything that has come after the dead white Greek guys of Western rhetoric canon just monuments to the greatness of Aristotle, basically. On the other hand, she critiques system studies, which kind of takes an opposite approach, sort of treating this ancient Western canon as relics, right? Like, this is ancient, it's from an old time. Women weren't represented, people of color weren't represented, people without means weren't represented. So systems studies emphasizes progress and the fact that theories are just continually making better off of what's come before. Now, obviously, Blair doesn't see either of these as a solution to cutting through all of the internal biases of historians throughout time. But she does put forth an option, a potential solution, which she calls critical historical studies, which for her is asking some of the same questions as system studies, but it's not focusing so much on progress as much as she wants to focus on changing the narrative. So system studies is sort of building on the Western rhetorical canon and traditional history as though that is an acceptable foundation. And Blair says it's not. It's limited. It's putting emphasis on one area of the globe and one area of history that actually isn't the only foundation. It's not a complete foundation. So she puts forth critical historical studies as a possible solution. And then towards the end, sort of like the second half of the article, she kind of does a compare-contrast between the three different modes of each of these schools of thought about different things, about the text itself, about approaches to rhetorical subject. And I didn't put that on this slide, but that's something to keep in mind when you're reading. Like that second half where she's kind of comparing and contrasting across three different areas of rhetorical history, that's really useful because that's where she's showing how critical studies can be a useful solution. Okay, going real fast. Our next piece that we're going to talk about right here is the Royster piece about disciplinary landscaping. And I pulled out this quote to kind of give us a feel for Royster's main argument, because she is prefacing her whole piece on the fact that she asks this question, what if, right? And towards the beginning, she talks about what if we looked at rhetorical history from a non-male, non-elite lens. And here, this is towards the end of her piece, but she says, what if we treated what we know about the history of Western rhetoric as if it were merely what we know best, rather than what is best? So you can hear her echoing Blair's argument that what we have traditionally been fed as quote-unquote canon isn't all that there is. It might just be what we know best, and what historians who've traditionally been male and white and elite have wanted to focus on. Such a question, Royster says, opens up this world of possibility as we look out on a landscape that, by many accounts in contemporary work, is only still marginally revealed. So the bit that we do know about rhetorical history isn't all that there is, and that's exciting. So Royster, in her piece, she's talking about thinking about a landscape and thinking about how if we just change our position, if we change our focus, we might see something else in the landscape that we hadn't seen before. Of course, she leads off with this assertion that rhetorical scholarship is a testament to Western dominance. And I don't think we'd be hard-pressed to disagree. I think that that is absolutely true, and we can find evidence for it everywhere. So Royster says she's going to challenge and ask this what-if question. What if I approached rhetorical history from a Southern Hemisphere positionality instead of a Western European positionality? What if I took a non-male or female position and focused only on females, not on males? And what if I looked at marginal voices, folks who don't have money or means, as opposed to just the elites who are creating culture where they are? This sort of frames her whole article, and she comes up with these beautiful, amazing examples, everything from pre-Egyptian priestesses who are writing before the first writing in cuneiform was dated. That's wild and amazing. And talking about how this female priestess is creating culture through her knowledge of writing and through her use of poetry as a way to change the narrative about this deity. Then she moves on to some of her own more contemporary work where she's looking at African American rhetorical moves in 19th century magazines for African American women to organize, to sort of come together and use rhetorical strategies within a genre that's not typically given much credit, right? A woman's magazine isn't given as much credit as, say, a speech given at Harvard. But, so she's looking at this non-elite type of genre and how what these women are doing counts as rhetoric, which is a really important question. It's one of our formative questions for this class. What counts as rhetoric? And how can we tell when something is rhetorical? That's something I want you guys to think about in your reading responses and talk about in your discussions. How can we tell if something counts as rhetoric? And then finally, Royster kind of ends her piece talking about knowledge using versus knowledge building. So it's kind of like, well, where do we go from here? If we can see that there is purchase in focusing on a non-male, non-Western, non-elite population for rhetorical studies, how can we convince the rest of the discipline that this is, number one, valid, number two, important, and number three, contributes to the discourse? And so that's where she comes up with this idea of persuasive knowledge use instead of knowledge building. Okay. Finally, we're going to talk about, I think, one of the most electrifying pieces in our whole semester, this piece by Victor Villanueva, where he is just so beautifully and lyrically raising issues of race and racism within the discipline of rhetoric and composition and beyond. So this quote from him is from the end of his piece again. He says, "We shouldn't ignore the concepts that come from the ex-colonies of Europe, nor should we ignore European attempts to think its ways through bigotries of all sorts, since the problems of racism and hatred are Europe's also. But we should not ignore the concepts that come of the members of the interior colonies like Puerto Rico and the American Indian nations." So Villanueva is talking about rhetoric and the precedence of racism within our discipline. And he is one of the foremost and most fearless voices continually writing about this issue. I don't think I could talk about these issues without talking about Villanueva. Here, I think it's really interesting that he's laying the ground for us for the rest of the semester. You know, we just talked about Blair talking about how we need to have a critical historical view. We talked about Royster, who's talking about non-Western female voices. She focuses on Africa and contemporary diaspora from Africa. Now, Villanueva gives us this sort of new world perspective. And this is what I hope that we are thinking about when we shift our gaze across this landscape, like Royster says. There is so much more to see than just one continent, for example. And even within, if we could make a whole class on any particular school of rhetoric that we're going to look at, or any particular location, or any particular population. But Villanueva here is particularly showing us the rhetorical roots of the Americas. Basically, he's quoting the Incan and the Aztec rhetorical patterns. And then he just kind of moves at a breakneck pace through a critique of multiculturalism racism at the university level, at the K-12 level. I mean, he just is really lyrically and incisively talking us through some of the very real, painful moments of racism that, though he's giving us specific examples from his own life, I think we can all find connection points in a lot of the stuff that he's talking about, both in the educational realm and outside of it, within politics and just the news. But one of the cool things about Villanueva is that he is talking about racism within rhetorical studies in a really strategic way. So he's employing some of these rhetorical strategies even as he's critiquing racism within the discipline. It's just brilliant, right? So he's integrating poetry and literature. He's critiquing the Western canon, right? The dead white Greek guys. And he points out there's racism even in, so this kind of like connects us back to Blair, who's talking about taking a critical stance to history. But Villanueva takes some shots at critical theory itself, showing us moments where these big names in critical theory, like Kant, like Hegel, even there's systemic racism present and canonized in writing. This just kind of shows us that we need more dismantling of the systemic hegemony, basically, the status quo that's in place. It's deep, 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 deep roots, even in academic setting, an academic setting that's supposedly supposed to be quote unquote enlightened. Even the foundations of some of the disciplines that we study in have racist underpinnings, right? So these are all things to be thinking about as we move forward and studying rhetorical examples throughout history, throughout the globe, but we want to do so with a critical eye, and we want to do so with an acknowledgement of the fact that no one perspective is going to show us the whole story, and that the poison of racism is present everywhere. And that's unfortunate and gross, but there it is. And I want us to be aware of that and be able to think steadily about it throughout the semester. So is it going to be easy? No. But is it necessary? Yeah. And will racism within these texts go away by us not thinking about it or talking about it? It will not. So I think it's important for us in this class to be able to steadily look through this lens at all of the texts that we encounter and ask these kinds of questions, right? We want to break from the colonial mindset. We're trying to decolonize this early history of rhetoric as best we possibly can. And we're going to do it together. So I'm going to close out this mini lecture here. We'll leave it maybe on an unsatisfactory note, but this is good if it prompts you to go into your discussions with some important points to talk to each other about, or even questions that you might have. So I'm going to pull back to our full view and we'll close out this video. Alrighty, that does it for me this week. Like I said, you can always go back through if you need to pause or rewatch this video at any point. Please feel free. Don't forget to do your chat check-in number 1, as well as making sure that you touch base with your discussion groups to make sure that you guys know who is going to lead discussion when. Check out the discussion mini lesson if you want some tips and tricks for how to participate really fluidly in those discussions. And as always, please feel free to email me or post a question on the Ask and Answer board, and we will talk through whatever you need to talk through. All right. I hope you guys are having a great week. Bye.